dare you?
The scalding espresso splashed across the scarlet silk of Zara's evening gown, the heat soaking instantly through the luxury fabric to sear the skin beneath. Zara's scream ripped through the crystal-lit dining room like a serrated blade, shattering the ambient hum of high society chatter in a single heartbeat. She instinctively clutched at the ruin of her bodice, her breath hitching in shock as the burning liquid began to blister against her chest. And Adrian Wolfe laughed. He laughed with a sickening, entitled joy, standing over her as she sat trembling in her chair. His tailored light blue shirt, sleeves rolled up with casual arrogance, cost more than the monthly rent of the luxury apartment he'd once tried to trap her in. He leaned forward, his wide grin dripping with malice as he held the empty white porcelain cup like a weapon. "Consider that a reminder, Zara," he sneered, his voice ringing out across the suddenly paralyzed restaurant. "You can put on a red dress and play at being royalty, but you'll always be the girl I can break whenever I feel like it." Around them, the world went cold. The waiters froze, their gazes fixed firmly on the floor, knowing that the Wolfe family's influence could end their careers before dessert was served. The elite patrons at nearby tables suddenly found their menus fascinating, choosing to ignore the assault unfolding in the center of the room. To them, Adrian was untouchable, a man whose pedigree placed him far above the reach of basic human decency. But from the back of the room, a different kind of power began to move. A man in a perfectly tailored black three-piece suit rose from his table, his presence commanding the very air in the restaurant. He didn't rush. His movements were unhurried and deliberate, the stride of a predator who had already won the fight before it started. A dark, intricate dragon tattoo snaked up his neck, peeking out from a crisp white collar, a signature of an underworld authority that even the Wolfe family hadn't dared to cross. Behind him, two silent men in black suits moved in perfect, lethal symmetry. Kang Tae-hyun's cold, intense gaze locked onto the back of Adrian's head. Adrian was still laughing, completely unaware that the dragon he had only heard of in hushed whispers was now standing directly behind him, ready to settle a debt that could never be repaid with money. When Adrian realizes he didn't just assault his helpless ex, but the wife of the most dangerous man in the city, do you think he should beg for mercy, or is it time for the dragon to teach him a lesson he'll never forget? Hello, family. How are you doing? Before we proceed, I would love to know where you are watching from. Drop in the comment and subscribe to this channel if you are new here. Now let's proceed to the story. The silence in the restaurant was no longer the awkward quiet of bystanders. It was the suffocating stillness that precedes a lightning strike. Adrian Wolfe stood over Zara, his chest heaving with the sick adrenaline of his own cruelty, a jagged smirk still etched onto his face. He began to reach down, his hand twisting to grab her chin, to force her to look at him while she wept. "I told you, Zara, you don't get to just walk away from." He never finished the sentence. A hand, encased in a black leather glove, clamped onto Adrian's wrist with the finality of a steel trap. Adrian gasped, his head snapping around. He expected a waiter or perhaps a brave manager he could buy off. Instead, he found himself staring into eyes that didn't look human. They were as dark and cold as the bottom of a frozen lake. Kang Tae-hyun didn't look angry. He looked like a man observing a stain on his shoe that he was about to wipe away. "You're hurting my wife," Tae-hyun said. His voice was a low, melodic baritone that somehow carried to every corner of the silent room. Adrian's smirk faltered, replaced by a confused, defensive snarl. "Your wife? Who the hell are you? Do you have any idea whose family you're touching? My father is." "Irrelevant," Tae-hyun interrupted. With a movement so fluid it looked like a dance, Tae-hyun increased the pressure on Adrian's wrist and stepped into his personal space. The sheer mass of the man, the tailored breadth of his shoulders, and the raw, predatory scent of cedarwood and iron seemed to shrink Adrian instantly. Behind Tae-hyun, Min-seok and the other bodyguards stepped forward, their shadows stretching long across the marble floor like the wings of a descending crow. The dragon tattoo on Tae-hyun's neck seemed to pulse in the flickering candlelight. To Adrian, it was just ink. To anyone who knew the streets of Seoul or the boardrooms of the Pacific, it was a death warrant. Tae-hyun didn't use his fists. He simply twisted his hand, and the sound of Adrian's joints popping echoed through the room. Adrian let out a strangled yelp, his knees buckling. Tae-hyun didn't let him fall. He forced him down, driving him to the floor until Adrian was kneeling in the very puddle of hot coffee he had poured onto Zara's dress. "Kneel," Tihayan commanded softly. "Since you find it so amusing to look down on others, let's see how the floor feels from your perspective." Zara sat frozen, her hand pressed against the burn on her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She watched as the man who had terrorized her for years was reduced to a trembling mess by a single look from her husband. The martyr complex she had carried, the belief that Adrian was an unstoppable force, began to fracture. Tihayan let go of Adrian's wrist and reached out to Zara. His touch was the polar opposite of the violence he had just displayed. He brushed a stray curl from her forehead, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that made her eyes well with fresh tears, not of pain, but of relief. "Are you hurt, my heart?" he asked, his voice now a private, velvet caress. I'm okay," she whispered, though the red welts forming on her skin lied for her. Tihayan's gaze returned to Adrian, and the tenderness vanished instantly. It was as if a light had been extinguished, leaving only the abyss. He leaned down, his face inches from Adrian's. "I know your name, Adrian Wolfe. I know your father's accounts. I know the warehouse on 4th Street where you keep your secrets," Tihayan whispered. Adrian's face went bone-white. He hadn't told anyone about the warehouse. "You thought you were a hunter because you chased a woman who was too kind to fight back. You didn't realize you were trespassing in a dragon's territory." Tihayan stood up, adjusting the cuffs of his white shirt, as if he hadn't just dismantled a man's soul. He signaled to Minsiok. "The Wolfe family has enjoyed a long autumn," Tihayan said, his voice echoing with the lethal authority of a king. "Tell the accountants to start the winter. I want their assets frozen by dawn. I want their reputation incinerated by noon. And Adrian." He looked back at the man sobbing on the floor. "Don't bother running. The hunt has already begun." Tihayan leaned down and swept Zara into his arms, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. He didn't look at the crowd, the manager, or the cameras. He simply walked out of the restaurant, his bodyguards forming a wall of black suits behind him. Behind them, Adrian Wolfe sat in the spilled coffee, realizing too late that he had poked a hole in the sky, and the storm was coming for everything he owned. The interior of the armored sedan was a sanctuary of cool air and soft leather, but the atmosphere remained thick with Tihayan's simmering, silent fury. He held Zara against his side, his large hand shielding the reddened skin of her chest as if his touch alone could pull the heat from the burn. He didn't speak, but his jaw was a hard line of granite. To the world, he was the dragon, a man of commerce and blood. To Zara, in this moment, he was a fortress. "Minsiok," Tihayan said, his voice cutting through the hum of the engine. "Yes, Chairman," the bodyguard replied from the front seat, already holding a tablet. "The restaurant, who owns the deed?" "The Grand Pavilion is owned by a holding company under the Vance Group, Chairman. They've been looking for an exit strategy for months." "Buy it," Tihayan commanded. "I want the sale finalized within 30 minutes. Pay triple the market value if you must, but I want the digital deed in my inbox before we reach the villa." Zara looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Tihayan, you don't have to do that. It's just a building." He looked down at her, his expression softening for a fleeting second before returning to its lethal focus. "It is not a building, Zara. It is a place that stood by and watched you suffer. In my world, silence is complicity. If they did not have the courage to protect my wife when they thought she was a waitress, they do not deserve the privilege of serving her when they know she is a queen." As the car glided through the neon-soaked streets of the city, Tihayan's phone began to glow with a series of rapid-fire notifications. He swiped through them with a practiced, predatory efficiency. In the digital shadows, the wolf hunt had already moved past the physical realm. Tihayan's elite team of black hat hackers, men who lived in the encrypted dark web spaces the syndicate called home, had bypassed the Wolfe family's primary firewalls. They weren't just looking for files, they were looking for the lifeblood of men like Adrian, their liquidity. "We've breached the offshore accounts in the Caymans," a voice crackled through Tihayan's earpiece. "Adrian's personal trust is being siphoned into a ghost account as we speak. His father's commercial credit lines are flagging for suspicious activity. By dawn, the Wolfe family will be worth exactly what they are worth in character. Nothing." Tihayan leaned back, his eyes fixed on the digital deed that had just arrived. He forwarded it to the restaurant's general manager with a single, devastating attachment. Back at the Grand Pavilion, the manager's tablet chimed. His face drained of color as he read the notice. The restaurant had been sold. The new owner's first order of business was not a menu change or a renovation. It was a termination list. Every waiter who had turned their back, every security guard who had remained stationary while Zara screamed, was fired effective immediately. No severance. No references. Their names were added to a blacklist that ensured they would never work in a luxury establishment in the city again. I want them to feel the cold, Ti-Hyun murmured, almost to himself. I want them to understand that when they chose to ignore a woman in pain, they chose their own ruin. He turned his attention back to Zara. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small, silk-wrapped kit. With a delicacy that seemed impossible for a man who had just dismantled an empire, he began to apply a cooling medicinal gel to her burn. That red dress was beautiful, he whispered, his eyes meeting hers. But tomorrow I will buy you 1,000 more, and the man who thought he could ruin your evening will find that the price of a silk dress is everything he has ever loved. Zara leaned her head against his shoulder, the cooling gel finally easing the physical sting, while the knowledge of his absolute devotion eased the spiritual one. The resilient secretary was beginning to understand that being married to the dragon didn't just mean being safe. It meant being the center of a world where justice was a personal, expensive, and devastatingly thorough affair. The Wolf family was bleeding out in the digital dark, and Ti-Hyun was only just getting started. The master bedroom of the Kang estate was a cathedral of shadows and silver moonlight, far removed from the neon violence of the city. Ti-Hyun sat on the edge of the velvet-tufted bed, his tailored jacket discarded, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar to reveal the full, coiled length of the dragon on his neck. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace as he dipped a fresh cloth into a bowl of cool, distilled water, his eyes never leaving Zara. She sat before him, draped in a silk robe the color of midnight. The adrenaline had finally ebbed, leaving behind a raw, hollow exhaustion. As Ti-Hyun gently dabbed at the angry red welt on her chest, his touch was so light it was almost a prayer. But his eyes were a different story. They were dark with a burgeoning storm. "It's just a burn, Ti-Hyun," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It will heal." Ti-Hyun stopped, the cloth hovering an inch from her skin. "The coffee will heal, Zara, but the way you flinched when he raised his hand, that didn't happen tonight. That is a ghost that has been living in your house for a long time." Zara looked away, her gaze landing on the flickering candles across the room. The silence stretched, heavy with the things she had spent years trying to bury. For a long time, she had played the role of the perfect, resilient partner, afraid that if she showed him the shattered pieces of her past, he would see her as a victim instead of a queen. But tonight, the mask had been scorched away. "He didn't just want to hurt me tonight," she said, her voice barely audible. "He wanted to remind me that he owns the memory of me. When we were together, Adrian didn't use his fists often. He used the world. He'd lock me out of the apartment in the middle of winter without a coat if I disagreed with him. He'd call my employers and tell them I was a thief until I was fired from 3 jobs in a row. He wanted me to believe that without him, I was invisible, that I was nothing." Ti-Hyun's grip on the cloth tightened until his knuckles went white. He didn't interrupt. He knew that for Zara, the telling was a form of exorcism. "The worst part wasn't the screaming," she continued, a single tear tracing a path through the faint shimmer of the cooling gel. "It was the day he found out I was trying to save money to leave. He didn't get angry. He just took my cat, the only thing I loved, and told me he'd rehomed it because I was too distracted to care for it. I never saw her again. He spent 2 years systematically stripping away every piece of my identity until I couldn't recognize my own face in the mirror." The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Ti-Hyun didn't move, but the lethal authority that defined him began to radiate outward, vibrating in the very air. To any other man, these were stories of a toxic ex. To the head of the Kang syndicate, they were a list of sins that required a blood sacrifice. He reached out, his hand cupping her face, forcing her to look into the abyss of his gaze. "He tried to erase you because he was terrified of your light, Zara. He wanted a ghost because a woman like you is a power he could never control." "I was so afraid to tell you," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I didn't want you to look at me and see someone who was broken." Hyun leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. His voice was a low, guttural vibration that felt like the earth shifting. I don't see someone broken. I see the woman who walked through a fire that would have turned most men to ash. But you need to understand something about the man you married. He pulled back just enough to look her in the eye, the dragon on his neck appearing to writhe in the dim light. I am not a man of law. I am a man of balance. Adrian Wolfe took your safety, your joy, and your peace. He treated your life like a playground for his cruelty. Hyun's thumb traced her bottom lip, his touch possessive and absolute. For every tear you shed in that apartment, I will take a year of his life. For every job he cost you, I will take a wing of his father's empire. I was going to ruin him for the coffee, Zara. Now I am going to erase him from the world. The cold rage in Hyun's eyes was more than just protection. It was a promise of total annihilation. He wasn't just going to bankrupt the Wolves, he was going to dismantle their history. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the sleeping city. He pulled his phone from his pocket and made a single call. He didn't wait for a greeting. Minseok, Hyun said, his voice as sharp as a garrote. The warehouse on 4th Street, I don't care about the money laundering files anymore. I want the personal archives. I want every video, every photo, and every contact Adrian Wolfe has ever touched. And find out where he rehomed that cat 3 years ago. If it's still alive, bring it to the villa. If it isn't... He paused, his gaze darkening. Bring me the man who took it. He ended the call and turned back to Zara. The dragon had been provoked, and the hunt had shifted from a corporate execution to something much more primal. He walked back to her, kneeling between her legs and wrapping his arms around her waist, anchoring her to him. Tonight you sleep, he whispered. Tomorrow you watch the world change. Zara leaned into him, the weight of her secret finally shared. She realized then that she hadn't just married a protector, she had married a force of nature. And as the moon climbed higher, the Wolfe family had no idea that their entire world was currently being weighed in the hands of a man who found them severely wanting. The morning sun had barely begun to touch the glass towers of Seoul when the digital guillotine fell. Adrian Wolfe woke not to the gentle sunlight of his penthouse, but to the frantic, incessant vibration of a phone that would not stop screaming. When he finally reached for it, his vision blurred by the remnants of a chemical-induced sleep, he didn't find the usual sycophantic praise on his social feeds. Instead, he found a nightmare. While Adrian had been sleeping, Hyun's team had been working with surgical precision. They hadn't just leaked a few grainy photos. They had released a curated, high-definition archive of Adrian's most depraved moments. By 6:00 a.m., every major news outlet and gossip blog was plastered with videos of the billionaire's darling in the throes of drug-fueled rages, squandering his family's prestige in dark corners of the city's underground clubs. There were ledgers showing the donations he'd used to silence previous victims, and most devastatingly, the raw footage from the restaurant, the sight of him laughing while pouring scalding coffee on a defenseless Zara. In the master suite of the Kang Villa, Hyun sat in a silk chair, a cup of black tea steaming on the table beside him. He wasn't watching the news, he was watching Zara. She was dressed in a soft cream lounge set, her curls gathered loosely at the nape of her neck. She held her tablet with trembling fingers, her eyes wide as she scrolled through the comments. For the first time in years, the public narrative wasn't controlled by the Wolfe PR machine. The world was seeing Adrian for exactly what he was, a monster. The Wolfe stock has dropped 15% in pre-market trading, Hyun said, his voice as calm as a predator in high grass. By noon, his father will have no choice but to call an emergency board meeting. By evening, they will be voting to strip Adrian of his titles. Zara looked up, the glow of the screen reflecting in her dark eyes. I never thought I'd see the day anyone would dare to speak against them. Even the journalists used to take his money. Everyone has a price, Zara, Hyun replied, standing up and walking toward her. He placed a hand on her shoulder, the warmth of his palm anchoring her. But my team didn't offer them money. They offered them the truth, backed by the kind of evidence that burns through any bribe. I didn't just want him disgraced. I wanted him isolated. A man like Adrian is only brave when he has a crowd of enablers behind him. I'm taking away his crowd. As the hours ticked by, the strike intensified. The first strike wasn't just about social media, it was about systemic erasure. Luxury brands that Adrian represented issued frantic statements severing ties. High society clubs revoked his memberships via automated emails. Even his friends, the men who had laughed with him as he bullied Zara, were now scrubbing their profiles of any association with him, terrified that the dragon's shadow might fall on them next. Hyun's phone chimed. It was a message from Min Seok. The elder wolf is attempting to reach the chairman. He is offering a formal apology and a settlement. Hyun didn't even bother to read the full text. Delete it, he commanded the heir. I don't want his money. I want his son to understand what it feels like to be the one who is invisible. I want him to know the terror of being the one nobody wants to help. He turned back to Zara, his gaze softening. He could see the conflict in her, the part of her that still couldn't believe she was allowed to be this powerful, and the part of her that was finally starting to breathe. Is it enough? He asked. Zara looked at the screen one last time. She saw a video of Adrian being hounded by reporters outside his apartment, his face pale and sweating, his untouchable aura shattered. He looked small. He looked pathetic. But she remembered the cat he had taken, the jobs he had ruined, and the scars he had left on her soul. No, she said, her voice growing stronger, a new edge of steel entering her tone. It's a beginning, but he hasn't felt the weight of the consequences yet. He still thinks he can buy his way out of this. Hyun smiled, a dark, dangerous expression that didn't reach his eyes. He'll learn, Zara. The social pariah is just the first skin I'm peeling away. Before I am finished, he will be begging for the life he tried to take from you. He reached out and gently closed her tablet, pulling her into his arms. Outside, the city was in an uproar, the wolf empire was in a tailspin, and the billionaire's darling was finding out that there was no bunker deep enough to hide from a dragon who had made his wife's justice his only mission. The hunt was no longer just about reputation. It was becoming a war of attrition. The downfall of the wolf family was not a slow crumble, but a violent, systemic collapse. By the third day of the digital onslaught, the family's skyscraper in the heart of Seoul felt less like a monument to success and more like a mausoleum. Victor Wolf, a man who valued his legacy more than his blood, stood in his glass-walled office, staring at the ticker tape that showed his life's work hemorrhaging value in real time. Behind him, Adrian sat slumped in a chair, his eyes bloodshot and his expensive light blue shirt wrinkled and stained. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. I can fix this, Dad, Adrian croaked, his voice cracking. We just need to hire a better crisis firm. We can sue for defamation. That woman Zara, she's lying. I'll make her retract everything. Victor turned around, his face a mask of cold, concentrated loathing. He didn't see his son. He saw a liability that was costing him billions. Without a word, he tossed a thick legal folder onto the desk. You're out, Adrian, Victor said, his voice devoid of emotion. I've filed the paperwork to remove you from the board. Your trust has been frozen, and your name is being stripped from every subsidiary. Effective immediately, you are no longer a wolf. You are nothing. You can't do that, Adrian screamed, springing to his feet. I'm your only heir. I'd rather leave my money to a stray dog than let you sink this ship, Victor hissed. The Kang Syndicate doesn't stop until the target is dead or destitute. You poked the dragon, Adrian. Now stay out of my sight before he decides I'm part of the problem. Cast out into the street with nothing but the clothes on his back and a dwindling balance in a hidden offshore account, Adrian's fear curdled into a suicidal, frantic rage. He didn't blame his own cruelty for his downfall. He blamed Zara. In his twisted mind, she was the one who had invited the monster into their lives. If he was going down, he would ensure she went down with him. Desperate and vibrating with a chemical-fueled mania, Adrian retreated to the one place the Wolf family name still carried a dark kind of currency, the iron-scrapped docks of the Incheon district. This was the territory of the Biko, the White Tigers, a rival gang that had spent decades clashing with Hyun's syndicate over smuggling routes. The air in the warehouse smelled of salt, rust, and cheap tobacco. Adrian stood before a scarred man known as the Butcher, offering the last of his hidden funds, gold bars and bearer bonds he'd kept in a private safe. I want her, Adrian spat, his hands shaking as he pointed at a photo of Zara on his phone. And I want the man with the dragon tattoo neutralized, just long enough for me to get her back. I know the syndicate's security rotations. I know where they take her for her morning walks. The Butcher looked at the gold, then at the pathetic, broken man before him. He knew that attacking Kang Ti-hyun was a suicide mission, but he also knew that the syndicate was currently distracted by the wolf corporate takeover. The tigers had been looking for a crack in the dragon's armor, and Adrian was providing them with a map. "You're asking for a war, little wolf," the butcher rasped, his eyes glinting with greed and malice. "I'm asking for my property back," Adrian corrected, his voice dropping into a dark, delusional whisper. "Ti-hyun thinks he's a god. I want to show him that even gods bleed when you catch them off guard." While Adrian plotted in the shadows of the docks, the Kang villa remained a fortress of deceptive calm. Ti-hyun stood on the balcony, his sharp jawline set as he watched the perimeter. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the way the silence of a cornered animal is often the most dangerous sound of all. Min Seok approached from behind, his footsteps silent on the marble. "Chairman, Adrian Wolf has disappeared from our surveillance. He was last seen entering the Incheon docks. He didn't go there to hide." Ti-hyun's hand tightened on the stone railing, the dragon tattoo on his neck appearing to darken in the twilight. "He's gone to the tigers. He thinks he can fight fire with a flickering matchstick." He turned back toward the bedroom, where Zara was finally sleeping peacefully, unaware that her past was making one final, desperate grab for her throat. "Double the guard," Ti-hyun commanded, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "Tell the men to prepare for a raid. If the tigers want to play with the wolf, let them. But make sure they understand. Anyone who touches my wife will not live to see the sunrise. The hunt isn't over. It's just moving into the woods." Ti-hyun walked back inside and sat beside Zara, his large hand resting protectively near her head. He was a man accustomed to war, but this was different. This was personal. And as the moon rose over the Incheon docks, the dragon prepared to show the city that a cornered animal is no match for a predator who has everything to protect. The transition from the city estate to the mountain fortress was a blur of high-speed curves and silent, armored precision. As the city lights faded into the rear view, replaced by the jagged, pine-covered silhouettes of the Buckhanson foothills, Zara felt the weight of the world begin to lift. This was the Dragon's Lair, a secluded villa built into the very rock of the mountain, protected by biometric scanners, thermal imaging, and a small army of Ti-hyun's most loyal men. Inside, the villa was a masterpiece of glass and cedar, designed to be both a sanctuary and a command center. Ti-hyun led her to the terrace, where a heated infinity pool mirrored the star-choked sky. The air up here was crisp, tasting of snow and pine, a stark contrast to the metallic scent of blood and chemicals that had followed them for days. Ti-hyun moved behind her, his large hands resting on her shoulders. He could feel the tension still radiating from her, the way her muscles coiled as if waiting for the next strike. He leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "You are safe here, Zara. The tigers can scream at the gates all they want, but they will never cross this threshold. This is our ground." Zara turned in his arms, looking up at the sharp, aristocratic lines of his face. The dragon on his neck seemed less like a warning here and more like a guardian spirit. "I'm not just afraid for me anymore, Ti-hyun. Adrian is a cornered animal, and he's dragging dangerous people into his orbit. I don't want you to lose everything just to settle my past." Ti-hyun's gaze darkened, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a possessive heat. "Everything I have built, the syndicate, the wealth, the reputation, it means nothing if it cannot protect the one thing I truly value. You are not my past, Zara. You are my legacy. Adrian isn't just fighting a man, he's fighting a force of nature that will burn the world to keep you warm." He led her to a low sofa by the fireplace, where a fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. For the first time since the night in the restaurant, the silence between them wasn't filled with the static of war. It was filled with the heavy, rhythmic beating of two hearts finding a shared pace. Zara reached out, taking his hand and tracing the calluses on his palms, marks of a life spent in the shadows. "He told me once that I was a void, that I was lucky anyone even looked at me. For a long time, I believed him. Even when I married you, there was a part of me that thought it was a dream I didn't deserve." Ti-hyun pulled her closer, tucking her head under his chin. "Then we will end that lie tonight. Adrian gave you scars, but I will give you an empire. He gave you fear, but I will give you the power to never feel it again." They sat in the warmth of the fire, the resilient secretary, and the cold boss, disappearing into the simple roles of a husband and wife. It was a moment of deep, quiet healing, a shedding of old skins. Zara felt the last of Adrian's influence crumbling, replaced by the absolute, unwavering devotion of the man holding her. "I want him finished," Zara whispered, her voice no longer trembling. It was the voice of a woman who had finally stepped into her own strength. "Not just for me, for every person his family has stepped on to build their throne. I want to see him realize that he is the one who is nothing." Tae-hyun leaned back, a dark, satisfied smile touching his lips. He liked the steel in her voice. It was a reflection of his own. "He will. The tigers think they have found a weakness. They don't realize they've walked into a trap. Tomorrow we stop reacting and we start the final harvest." He stood up, lifting her into his arms and carrying her toward the master suite, where the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the valley. Down there in the dark, the wolf family was breathing their last breaths of freedom. Up here, in the lair, a new era was being born. "Tonight we rest," Tae-hyun murmured against her forehead. "Tomorrow the dragon breathes fire." As they lay together in the quiet of the mountain, the vow was sealed. It wasn't just a promise of survival, it was a vow of absolute retribution. The hunt was entering its final, most lethal stage, and for the first time in her life, Zara N. Wenkwokang wasn't afraid of the dark. She was the one controlling it. The transition from the sanctuary of the mountains back to the glitz of Seoul felt like stepping from a dream into a meticulously staged play. The gala was an ocean of tuxedos, champagne flutes, and forced smiles, held at a venue that exuded the kind of old money the Wolf family had once claimed as their birthright. But tonight, the atmosphere was different. The air was charged with a heavy, electric expectation, as if the walls themselves knew that a predator was in the room. Zara stood at the center of the ballroom, a vision of defiant beauty in a gown of midnight blue that shimmered like a deep-sea trench. She looked every bit the syndicate queen, composed, elegant, and entirely alone, or so it seemed. "Target is in position." Min Seok's voice crackled almost imperceptibly in Tae-hyun's earpiece. Tae-hyun stood in the darkened gallery overlooking the ballroom, his silhouette obscured by the heavy velvet curtains. He adjusted the cuff of his shirt, his eyes locked on Zara with the intensity of a hawk. To anyone else, she was a socialite enjoying the evening. To him, she was the anchor of a lethal trap. Every movement she made was calculated to draw out the beast. He knew Adrian was watching. A man like Adrian, stripped of his wealth and disowned by his blood, would be unable to resist the sight of his property parading her freedom in public. The reports from the Incheon docks had confirmed that the white tigers were moving. They were desperate for a win against the syndicate, and Adrian's obsession was the perfect bridge. "I see movement at the service entrance," Min Seok whispered. "4 men, they aren't wearing tuxedos." Tae-hyun didn't flinch. "Wait, let them think the perimeter is soft. I want Adrian to see her. I want him to believe he's one before we close the cage." Zara felt the eyes on her. It wasn't the polite curiosity of the guests, it was the cold, prickling heat of a predator's gaze. She took a slow sip of her drink, her hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She moved toward the terrace, away from the safety of the crowd, just as they had planned. She was the bait, but she no longer felt like a victim. She felt like a hunter. As she stepped into the cool night air of the terrace, the sounds of the string quartet faded into a muffled hum. The shadows at the edge of the stone balustrade shifted. "You always did look better in blue," a voice hissed from the darkness. Adrian stepped into the moonlight. He looked wretched. His eyes were sunken, his skin sallow, and his once expensive clothes were stained with the desperation of the docks. Behind him, 3 massive men from the White Tigers emerged, their hands resting on the hilts of concealed blades. "Adrian," Zara said, her voice remarkably calm, "you look like you've had a difficult few days." "You did this," he snarled, taking a step forward, his fingers twitching. "You and your pet gangster, you thought you could take everything from me. You belong to me, Zara. I'm taking you back to Incheon, and by the time I'm done with you, you'll be begging for that hot coffee again." He lunged for her, his face twisted in a manic grin of triumph, but he didn't reach her. The glass doors behind Zara didn't just open. They seemed to explode with the weight of a sudden, overwhelming presence. Before Adrian's hand could touch her silk sleeve, A blur of black and silver intercepted him. Minseok appeared from the flank, a silent shadow that neutralized the first tiger with a sickeningly efficient strike to the throat. Simultaneously, the lights on the terrace flared to a blinding, surgical white. Taehyun stepped out from the darkness, his charcoal suit absorbing the light, his dragon tattoo appearing like a mark of judgment under the high-voltage lamps. He didn't run. He walked with the terrifying unhurriedness of a man who had already won. "You're late, Adrian," Taehyun said, his voice a low, lethal vibration that seemed to rattle the terrace stones. "I expected you 10 minutes ago." Adrian froze, his eyes darting between the fallen tiger and the man who now stood between him and Zara. He looked back toward the entrance, expecting his reinforcements, only to see the remaining tigers being forced to their knees by a dozen of Taehyun's elite guards. The trap hadn't just closed, it had collapsed the world around him. Adrian realized in a sudden, chilling moment of clarity that Zara hadn't been hiding. She had been leading him to the slaughterhouse. "Minseok," Taehyun commanded, never taking his eyes off Adrian. "Clear the guests. Ensure the police arrive in exactly 20 minutes, not a second sooner." Taehyun stepped closer to Adrian, his shadow falling over the smaller man like a shroud. He reached out and placed a hand on Zara's waist, pulling her flush against his side. "You wanted to show me that even gods bleed, Adrian," Taehyun whispered, his gaze as sharp as a razor. "I'm going to show you that even in a city of millions, there is nowhere you can hide from the man whose wife you dared to touch." Zara looked at Adrian, and for the first time she felt nothing but a cold, clinical pity. He wasn't a monster anymore. He was just a broken gear in a machine that was about to be crushed. The trap was complete, but the Night of the Dragon was only just beginning. The chaos on the terrace was a symphony of precision, but the hunt was not yet over. Adrian, fueled by a cocktail of chemical desperation and pure, unadulterated terror, saw a momentary opening as the syndicate guards swarmed the remaining white tigers. With a frantic, animalistic shove, he knocked over a heavy decorative urn, creating a second of clattering distraction, and bolted toward the service stairs. "Minseok, stay with her," Taehyun's voice cracked like a whip. He didn't wait for a response. He was already moving, his silhouette a dark blur against the gala's gold-leafed opulence. The pursuit spilled out of the gala's marble halls and into the subterranean gloom of the parking garage. The roar of a high-performance engine echoed off the concrete walls as Adrian scrambled into a stolen black sedan, tires screaming as he tore toward the exit. Taehyun didn't break his stride. He stepped into his own custom-built armored vehicle, the engine turning over with a predatory growl that promised absolute carnage. The chase through the rain-slicked streets of Seoul was a masterclass in lethal driving. Adrian drove like a man with nothing to lose, weaving through midnight traffic and blowing through red lights, his hands white-knuckled on the wheel. Behind him, Taehyun followed with a terrifying, rhythmic stability. He didn't swerve or panic. He simply closed the distance, his headlights fixed on Adrian's rearview mirror like the eyes of a persistent ghost. Every time Adrian thought he had found a gap, the dragon was there, nudging him, steering him away from the crowded boulevards and toward the desolate, industrial skeleton of the Incheon docks. Taehyun wasn't just chasing him, he was hurting him. He was driving Adrian back to the very place where the betrayal had been born. The sedan finally screeched to a halt outside the same rusted warehouse where Adrian had met the butcher. Adrian scrambled out, his legs nearly giving way, and fled into the cavernous, shadow-filled interior. He fumbled for a discarded iron pipe, backed against a stack of rotting shipping crates, his breath coming in ragged, pathetic sobs. The heavy steel doors of the warehouse creaked open. Taehyun walked in alone. He had discarded his suit jacket, his white sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark, intricate ink of the dragon tattoos that seemed to coil around his forearms like living shadows. The high bay lights overhead flickered to life, casting long, jagged shadows across the oil-stained floor. "You're still trying to fight, Adrian," Taehyun said, his voice flat and devoid of heat. "Even now, you think a piece of rusted iron makes you a match for the man you've spent a lifetime trying to emulate." "Stay back," Adrian shrieked, swinging the pipe wildly. "I'm a wolf. You can't do this. My father will find someone better than the tigers, someone who will end you." Taehyun didn't stop. He walked directly into the arc of the pipe. As it swung toward his head, he caught it with one hand, the impact barely vibrating his arm. With a flick of his wrist, he wrenched the metal from Adrian's grasp and tossed it aside. It clattered against the concrete, the sound of Adrian's final defense disappearing into the rafters. Tae-hyun grabbed Adrian by the throat and slammed him against the crates. The force was calculated, not enough to kill, but enough to ensure Adrian felt every ounce of his own insignificance. "True power isn't the money your father gave you, Adrian," Tae-hyun whispered, his face inches from the other man's. "It isn't the names you can drop or the coffee you can pour on someone who can't fight back. True power is the ability to decide who lives and who is erased. And right now, you are a ghost waiting for permission to disappear." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted burner phone. He held it up to Adrian's face. On the screen was a live feed of a local animal shelter 200 miles away. In a small, clean enclosure sat a black cat, looking healthy and well-fed. "I found your final victim," Tae-hyun said, his eyes flashing with a cold, righteous fury. "The only thing you ever touched that was truly innocent. My men took her an hour ago. She's going home to Zara." Adrian's jaw worked, but no sound came out. The realization that Tae-hyun had dismantled his entire life, his wealth, his family, his crimes, and even his petty vengeances, hit him like a physical blow. He began to weep, his body going limp in Tae-hyun's grip. "You don't deserve a quick end," Tae-hyun said, his voice dropping to a low, melodic growl. "You deserve to watch the world forget you existed." He dropped Adrian to the floor, where he curled into a ball, shivering. Tae-hyun turned his back, signaling to the shadows at the edge of the warehouse. Min-seok and 4 other men stepped forward, carrying folders filled with the evidence of Adrian's drug deals and the Wolf family's money laundering. "Hand him to the authorities," Tae-hyun commanded. "But make sure the inmates know exactly what he did to a woman who worked for her living. Let them teach him the lessons his father skipped." As Tae-hyun walked out of the warehouse and into the cool night air, he felt the weight of the night finally settle. The dragon had protected his queen, and the wolf had been hunted to extinction. He looked up at the moon, his thoughts already turning back to the villa, where Zara was waiting in the light he had fought so hard to keep pure. 1 year had passed since the night the silk was scorched, and the shadows of Seoul moved to claim their due. The high-rise glass of the former Wolf corporate headquarters still caught the sunset, but the name atop the building had been erased, replaced by a minimalist crest of a rising phoenix interlaced with a subtle, coiled dragon. Inside the executive boardroom, the air no longer smelled of stale cigar smoke and entitled greed. It smelled of fresh lilies and the crisp, clean scent of a new beginning. Zara N. Wankwokang sat at the head of the mahogany table, the very seat where Victor Wolf had once signed away the lives of others for profit. She was dressed in a suit of ivory white, sharp-shouldered and commanding, a stark contrast to the vulnerable red silk she had worn on the night her world changed. Across from her sat a team of lawyers and social advocates, their faces reflecting a quiet, profound respect. With a steady hand, Zara picked up a fountain pen, a gift from Tae-hyun, and signed the final document for the N. Wankwokang Foundation. The ink was barely dry before the reality of the moment settled over the room. This was not just a corporate restructuring, it was the final act of restoration. The assets once used to fund Adrian's debauchery and Victor's exploitation were now legally bound to provide housing, legal aid, and psychological support for women escaping domestic and systemic abuse. "It's done," Zara said, her voice resonant and clear, devoid of the tremors that had once defined her. "The first sanctuary opens in Incheon next month. We aren't just giving them a place to sleep, we're giving them the resources to take back their names, just as I took back mine." In the corner of the room, standing by the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the sprawling city, Kang Tae-hyun watched her. He was dressed in his signature charcoal suit, his hands clasped behind his back, the dragon on his neck partially hidden by his collar, but its presence felt by everyone in the room. He hadn't said a word during the meeting. He didn't need to. He was the silent, immovable mountain upon which Zara had built her new world. When the lawyers filed out, leaving them alone in the quiet of the twilight hour, Tae-hyun stepped forward. He walked to her side, his hand coming to rest on the back of her chair. Zara looked up at him, a tired but triumphant smile touching her lips. "You did it, Zara," he murmured. his voice a low vibration of pride. "You didn't just survive the fire. You took the embers and built a sun." "We did it," she corrected, reaching up to cover his hand with hers. "I couldn't have reclaimed this ground if you hadn't held the line." Tae-hyun leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "The line was easy to hold for a queen who never stopped fighting. Adrian thought he could turn you into a ghost, but he only succeeded in making you a legend." The news of the Foundation's launch was already trending across the digital landscape that had once been the site of their war. In a high-security prison block 300 miles away, Adrian Wolfe would see the headline on a grainy communal television. He would see the woman he tried to break standing tall, powerful, and utterly beyond his reach. He would spend his days in a cell, a forgotten name in a world that had moved on, while the property he claimed had become the architect of his family's total transformation. Outside, the city lights flickered to life. Zara stood up and walked with Tae-hyun to the window. In the courtyard below, she could see the gardens being planted, a place of peace on the very site where she had once been cornered. She felt a soft weight against her ankle and looked down. The black cat she had lost years ago, rescued by Tae-hyun's men from the fringes of the city, purred contentedly, its amber eyes reflecting the city lights. "Is the balance restored?" Tae-hyun asked, looking out at the city he still protected from the shadows. Zara leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the reflection of the dragon and the phoenix in the glass. She thought about the coffee, the scars, and the long, dark road they had traveled. She thought about the thousands of women who would now find safety behind the doors she had opened. "The balance isn't just restored, Tae-hyun," she whispered. "It's been rewritten." As the dragon and his queen stood together above the city, the story of the waitress and the bully became a fading echo, replaced by a new narrative of power, protection, and a justice that was as beautiful as it was absolute. The hunt was over. The foundation was laid,